Hey everyone, it's really great to see you all. It's great to be here. Yeah, good to see a lot of familiar faces out here, a lot of new ones, meet some of you in person for the first time. So this is pushing physics to the limit on Roblox, and physics aren't the only thing we're pushing to the limit here today. I'm pushing my time limit too and trying to cover a lot of ground in not a lot of time. So we're going to have to move fast. Remember, it's all being recorded. You can and should download the slides later. There's quite a few I had to cut for time. So I'm Giovanni Antoni Catini. I'm a senior software engineer on the physics team here at Roblox, currently embedded with the Avatar team, working on the future of character movement, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end. But right now, we're here to talk about physics engine in the real world. So particularly, we're going to talk about the Roblox physics engine and some of the techniques we use. We're going to focus a little bit particularly on what is a solver. And then we'll talk about numerical stability and some practical limits that come from those techniques that'll hopefully make more sense in that context. And then we'll touch on collisions and performance, the relative cost of different geometry types, understanding physics throttling, and how to read the macro profiler when things start getting slow. Because this is Roblox, then we're going to talk a little bit about physics replication, how network ownership works, and how the physics sender works, and a little bit about the consequences of security for all that. And then wrapping it up with a little brief glimpse of some of the exciting things that are coming in the future. So let's get into the Roblox physics engine and what is a physics engine really. So typical in games, what we're running here is a rigid body physics simulation. We run ours at 240 hertz. That's unusually high step rate for games, but we really care a lot about fidelity here. So what are we doing at 240 hertz? It's like each step, we update collision detection where we find intersection between parts and create contact constraints between them. And then we run the solver, where we integrate body velocities, solve all these constraints together, and finally update the body positions. So most of this is probably fairly self-explanatory, but the concept of a solver might not be super familiar. So in particular, I want to cover what is a solver. So it's literally just algebra. It literally just solves constraints as mathematical equations. So for all of our constraints, we represent them as some kind of matrix equation. Like, for example, a ball socket constraint says attachment 0.world position must equal attachment 1.world position. OK, really obvious. They can move, rotate all about that point, but those 2 points have to match up. Extending this into something like a hinge constraint, we actually reuse the ball socket solver constraint as is. But we additionally say attachment 0.world axis must line up with attachment 1.world axis. So that's a little bit of a simplification. I'm leaving out some perpendicular to orthogonal bases formed by, but conceptually that is what we're doing. So primarily we solve these equations for velocities. We do some calculus, we take the first partial derivative, we get equations of velocities, we solve that. And we do that because that conserves momentum and energy in the system. Now, secondarily, we do a little bit of positional correction where we solve for positions to correct for drift in position over time. And this does drain a little bit of energy from the system. We do have a little bit of latent energy drain, but it's so little that you wouldn't really notice unless you were actively looking for it. So a little bit of history about the Roblox solvers in particular. Some of you may or may not know this, but the original spring penalty solver that we had from launch was written by David Baszucki himself, Mr. Builderman himself. And that had a really good run so far as solvers go. It served us for like 10 years or so, but around like 2015, it was starting to show its age, so we introduced the Pgs Solver, written by Dr. Maciek Mazurski, who's our resident mathematician and solver expert and president of Roblox Canada. In 2018, we made some improvements to it. Well, really me, I mean Maciek, and we augmented it with a hybrid Ldl Solver, which in 2019 totally superseded Dave's original solver. So brave new world here. So what do these acronyms mean? We sort of have like two solvers here, so I'm going to start by diving into the first one, the newer, better one, the Ldl Solver. So the Ldl Solver is a direct solver. How it works is we break the workspace up into islands of Ldl-supported constraints, and we represent each of those islands as like one giant equation. And we solve that giant equation directly. We do Ldl decomposition on that matrix, invert it directly, and like boom, we got the solution. So because of that, Ldl constraints are very robust. They're very rigid. And thanks to some clever preconditioning, overconstrained Ldl systems tend to fail very gracefully. Major caveat to it, it can only solve equality constraints, like ball socket constraints, hinge constraints, prismatic constraints. Things like in that last slide here actually had the equality in it. I broke this down into like a table in some of the bonus slides, so if you download the slides, you can look at that. So for things that LDL cannot solve, we still have the Pgs solver, which is an iterative solver. So for each of those 240 hertz world steps that we do, we run 20 equation solving steps for Pgs. And each of those steps is sort of loose, very loosely analogous to something like Newton's method or binary searching for a solution, if you're familiar with either of those. Where we're like solving for the impulse that we're going to apply to those parts at the end of the frame. And this is, like I said, used for inequality constraints that LDL can't solve. Things like contacts, which is like this point must be on this side of this plane, which is like dot product greater than. It's like obviously not an equality. Rope, same things. Actually, all limits for in actuators for all constraints are actually separate little solver level constraints that go through PGS. Again, break down on a bonus slide. So PGS it's fairly robust. It's a fairly industry standard technique. Most other game physics engines I know of are primarily PGS solvers. But it's not as rigid as LDL. And overconstrained systems have this weird kind of tendency to explode a little bit. So why is that? So let's talk about numerical stability, because life is hard, nothing is perfect, and we got to deal with that. So here at Roblox, we're solving equations with computers in real time with finite precision floating point numbers, oftentimes on terrible hardware. So the reality is there's some practical limits that we got to talk about. So like I said before, PGS is an iterative solver. And so I have two graphs here. This is solving over those 20 solver steps, solving for the impulse for a new contact. So in this top one, with a system with a really obvious solution, it converges nicely. You see by the fifth step, we've pretty much nailed the solution and we're just refining it. But for this system where you have like two constraints that conflict and there's no solution, call those systems overconstrained, or some other situations that we'll get into where it just converges too slowly, PGS kind of goes off in some direction looking for the solution, which it just never finds, and it just gets cut off at some random point, and you get some random crazy impulse applied. And it ends up really unstable, and that's where explosions come from. So another common place where this comes up, besides overconstrained systems, is mass ratio issues. This is the common bane of a lot of solvers. Pretty much every game engine solver that I'm aware of has issues with this. It comes up naturally where you have small bodies connected to large bodies. And in this case, PGS just converges too slowly. We don't find the correct solution in time, and this leads to jitter, like little vibrations. A real common case is like small knuckle parts in suspension systems. See, before I've tuned it, it's just really jittery here. So if I select those small parts and I just increase the density of them, here I increase it from 0.7 to 30. And then it's nice and stable. So you can also decrease the density of the larger part, obviously, up to you. It's really hard to give general one-size-fits-all advice for acceptable mass ratios because it really depends on gravity, the nature of your mechanism. It's really about the relative magnitudes of impulses in the solver. But with PGS, you'd roughly want to shoot for like a 10-to-1 mass ratio between connected parts. And LDL constraints, in theory, are way better at this. There is some limit at some point because of just numerical precision, but in practice, you'll never really run into that. Another thing you got to watch for is nonlinear behavior. Our solver, like pretty much most solvers, is a linear solver. It's a linear approximation of a nonlinear reality. So this particularly plays in when you have rotating objects, particularly fast-moving objects. And this is really tricky because then you have your tangent linear velocity that most constraints are playing with. It starts to really diverge from the actual path that is being traced by that point. So, and you can see here on this motor turning around. At 50, it's a nice smooth circle. And once we start getting up to 230, it's more like octagon, square, and gross triangle. So because of this, there's kind of an effective practical limit on rotational velocity. Generally, you want to shoot for no more than 45 degrees of rotation per 240 hertz world step. So that, for us, is 200 radians per second, or 2,000 RPM. So because of that, there's also a practical top speed limit on wheeled vehicles. Assuming a wheel diameter of 3 studs, that's a linear speed limit of 300 studs per second. Or if you consider a stud to be 0.28 meters with avatars as people, that corresponds to like roughly 200 miles per hour. And to really get over that, you really have to be creative, and because your hinges and the contacts will start being a little less stable at that point. So one thing that helps with it is just good constraint limits. Good constraint limits are very important. You want to limit your constraints to known valid states, and this can make a well-designed mechanism self-healing and stop temporary instability from becoming a permanent jam. So these motors here, the one on the left has prismatic limits, the other one doesn't. So when I rev it up past 200, past that unstable seed, they're both tearing themselves apart the same way. But when I slow it back down to 50, the one without limits, the pistons have flipped over to the other side and it'll just never run again. Or as anyone who's probably worked on a car game before, you've probably seen like wheels getting stuck on the hood of a car under the geometry. Good constraint limits pretty much stop that from happening. Also, motor and servos, you probably want to tune your max force and max velocity limits. Some of these things default to infinity, and if you leave them like that, sometimes you'll get an infinite impulse and bad things happen. So don't use more force than you need. You know, think about how much mass are you actually trying to move and tune for that. So now let's talk a little bit about collisions and performance. So there's two major phases of collision detection. So we have a broad phase where we quickly eliminate pairs that cannot possibly collide. We use a spatial hash for this. It's just tracking parts as they move at all. And then after that, we have narrow phase where we test individual shape pairs for intersection. And then from that, we generate a contact manifold. There's some description of the contact, usually like a set of contact points, some normals, a depth, information that we can use to build solver constraints that will depenetrate those bodies. So of course, narrow phase complexity depends heavily on shape type, and some types are more complex than others. Obviously, spheres are the cheapest. If we had them, they'd be followed as a close second by capsules, which are basically just two spheres. Up next is boxes. The nice symmetry of them has some nice properties, a little more complex. Cylinders actually are surprisingly complex. Those flat, sharp edge caps create a bit of complexity trying to generate a stable manifold. And then a little ways below that, you start getting into the convex shapes, like collision fidelity hole, you know, somewhat convex shapes with a lot of faces. And then like way down here at the bottom, we have collision fidelity default, which gets its own slide because it can be a bit of a noob trap. It is the default for a good reason, because it just works. What you see is what you get, more or less, but it has a price to it. It can be slow. So what collision fidelity default gives you is a convex decomposition of your mesh. It's generated in Studio or RCC. We voxelize the mesh, and we generate convexes to fit the voxelized shape. That can be a lot of convexes. Like each of those different colors there is an independent convex that has like at least 4 sides, and we have to factor all of these in for our narrow phase collision detection. So this isn't quite as bad as each of those being its own part, but it is heavy. There's no algorithm that we really know of that like are obvious improvement on this. There's some really popular ones that sometimes give better results, but not always. And they're much slower, like they take minutes to generate, where this algorithm takes seconds. It's something we're not giving up on, but it's a really hard problem. So you can enable this visualization to see how bad your geometry actually is by going to Studio Physics settings and enable show decomposition geometry. There's also a clone trooper plugin that's really great for toggling this off and on at runtime without restarting Studio. So what you can do about this, use box or hole where possible. Hole tends to hug the shape more closely because it is like a vertex hole without any voxelization. Sometimes you might want to do the manually break up your mesh into smaller, more convex mesh parts, especially for stuff like terrain meshes, break it up into smaller chunks yourself. Sometimes it's better to just disable collisions on a really complicated mesh, maybe make your render mesh massless, non-collide, weld a bunch of basic colliders, or more simpler, more convex hole parts to it. But if you do set something for non-collide, make sure to set collision fidelity to box, because that's much less replicated data. It's otherwise we replicate all that convex decomposition information. So when you have too much collision fidelity default stuff, or just a lot of stuff going on in your world in general, you'll probably run into physics throttling. And that happens initially when you have a long physics frame, we'll simulate more steps on the next frame to try to keep up. And if just the new state of the world is just, physics is just really slow, that can quickly go into a death spiral where simulation can't keep up. And once we get to the point where trying to keep up with real time would drop us below 15 frames per second, we start throttling. And just physics time slows down, we just give up on real time, everything moves slower except for humanoids unless we still can't keep 15, and then the humanoids start moving slow too, and that's when you know things are really bad. So you can hit Shift F4 in the client to toggle the physics debug panel, and there's this nice throttle percentage there, and that's like the percentage of real time that we're running at. So you can look at that to see if this is what's happening when things are slow. So when that is below 100%, the first thing you should do, like your first instant should be like Control F6, open up the micro profiler, pause mode detailed, works in client and in studio. Though you should prefer profiling the client, more representative. This is just your best friend when anything is slow in general. I really wanted to spend a lot more time like breaking down some of the physics task labels, but it took a lot of time. I had to cut it. So there's a bonus slide. Download that later. Check it out. So quick reminder, make sure to profile on low-end devices. Our min spec is low for a reason. People with low-end devices tend to spend just as much money as people with high-end devices. Even if you're shooting for like a high-end like PC console experience, console CPUs can be shockingly low-end. Like the Xbox One processor, it's basically a mid-range laptop processor. So your extreme gaming workstation, probably not representative of our player base. So, and performance is an essential mass market accessibility feature, so don't neglect this. So this is Roblox. Let's talk about physics replication. So welcome to the internet. Roblox is distributed. So you may have heard the words like always online before. It's sort of an internal motto. So every game is multiplayer by default here. Everything gets replicated from the server down to the clients. And dealing with client-server networking is pretty much a given for like any game at all. So what we actually run is a distributed physics simulation where we have many players interacting with physics, and sometimes that's more worky than even the server can keep up with on its own. So we dynamically distribute the work of simulation. So each mechanism can be simulated by the server or assigned to clients. And only one machine authoritatively simulates a mechanism at a time, and we call this system of distributing this network ownership. So network ownership is broken down on the basis of network ownership units. It roughly corresponds to the basis of a mechanism, where a mechanism is a collection of parts linked by constraints with like a few little weird caveats. Align position, align orientation with reaction forces false do not necessarily merge parts into the same mechanism. And if you have multiple anchored parts as part of that system, sometimes like something like a suspension bridge, it'll probably get split into two mechanisms, though that's something I hope to fix eventually. But that's just like the current reality of things. So you don't need to set it like on each part, like just really once per network ownership unit. So by default, network ownership is assigned automatically, assigned and automatically reassigned. So if you set ownership manually, it'll never be reassigned. It's like we'll leave it alone. But in automatic mode, this is dynamic. It's based on a radius per client, based on like, your physics performance of that client. So I'd like to give more default, but it's kind of hard because it's just a little fuzzy. It's like, hey, it's the dynamic based on performance. So another thing that plays into this is on contact broad phase islands, formerly known as the buffer zone. So when you're about to collide with a remotely owned part, your client will start simulating it too. And this isn't an authoritative simulation. You still don't own it. This gets overridden every frame by network interpolation, so you usually won't see this happen at all. But what this does allow for is some limited interaction that makes like unanchored parts you don't own less of a brick wall. And remember like any kind of game with cars, like a few years ago, you drive into a player and it's just like boom, your car flips over. It wasn't very fun. But now you plow right through them and a split second later you see them go flying. So it's still not perfect, but it's a lot better, and this is what makes that possible. So this limited local simulation has a couple limits to it. There's a part count limit. All of these are dynamic based in performance, but the part count limit is 20 or greater. There's also a recursive contact step limit. Like if you crash into like a stack of blocks, that's like 1 or greater depending on performance. There's also a dynamic radius per client. So for things that you don't own, there's network interpolation. So if you are the authoritative simulator of a mechanism, the physics sender will be sending updates at 15 hertz for clients, 16 hertz for the server. And we smoothly interpolate between the last 2 or more frames that we've received. And this does add a little bit of latency, like 1/send rate up to 250 milliseconds. That depends on network conditions. And that can differ per mechanism. It's not per client, it's per mechanism. And it's hard to go into more detail than that because we're changing the algorithm that determines this like a lot right now. So that's pretty much as much detail as I can give. One thing to remember is C-frame property setter resets interpolation. C-framing tends to equal chalky replicated movement, which you reserve for teleporting. And physics replication and property replication do work on different timelines. Remember, it's like a different send job, and there's the interpolation delay. So usually the property updates will come first. So when you're C-framing something, there'll usually be like a little bit of visual discontinuity until those line up. So for all this to work correctly, mechanism consistency is critical. Physics replication relies on mechanism structure being consistent between the server and all clients. Like our replication data is like packed per mechanism, and it references individual assembly routes. So adding, removing, enabling, or disabling constraints or welds on different clients differently will lead to mechanism desynchronization. It's surprising how often I see this being an issue in people's games. So this just is orphan network ownership units that are owned and not simulated by someone because the client just doesn't know it exists because it doesn't have that particular mechanism by that name. And those usually end up never simulated. It tends to look like a sleep issue. You walk up to it, and it gets pulled into the buffer zone, and it might start moving, but it stops moving when you walk away. If you see behavior like that, you're probably experiencing mechanism desynchronization. So you should look between like the server and the clients, making sure the mechanism structure is completely identical. So basically, just make all mechanism changes from the server. Just keep it consistent, let you really know what you're doing. If you think you know what you're doing, you probably don't, so just be careful. So there are some consequences for security for all this. It's player network ownership is like, as I'm sure most of you know, it's a limited form of trust in the client. That trust is limited to position and velocity. It's a trade-off in responsiveness and security because server authorship means all interaction gets delayed by the full round-trip latency. So in an ideal world, you would trust but verify, do some kind of perfect client-side predictive, server-side authoritative networking model that's typically used in AAA. But to implement this, you need like partial rollbacks, resimulation. It's basically your engine needs to be able to do this back to the future style time travel, where you rewind time, make some changes, fast forward. It's very complicated to implement. It's expensive to compute. And it's really not very generic. And then there's like Lewis state for us. So we're not giving up on this, but don't hold your breath for us to generically solve security for you. It's just fundamentally, at just like theoretical level, it's a very hard problem. So it's hard to give game-specific advice, but a few things everyone can do is just really anchor everything that shouldn't move. It's impossible to exploit then pretty much. Manually assign server ownership where responsiveness isn't important, and beyond that, it's just things that are going to be more specific to your game that make sense. So sanity check heuristics like region range checks, limiting collisions with collision groups, like between characters, so you can't like fling your character into someone else's character. Just moving things back, just resetting velocity position when they seem to be out of bounds. It's really just no generic silver bullet. It's hard to say a lot more without knowing more about your game. So the future isn't all bleak. In positive news, we do have some exciting things in store. In particular, right now, I'm working on some new solver constraints for new character physics as part of the new Lua character controller to eventually, hopefully, replace humanoids as a default. It's based on a new solver constraint formulation. It's got much more configurable properties. It's got real contact solver friction. That's the part I'm most excited about. This isn't like imitation crab humanoid friction. It's the real deal. So all around, it should be a much more stable foundation for all kinds of character controllers. But yeah, there's a lot more in store for that. So also capsule part type, I had this like 90% production ready from a hack week last year. I just need to find another week to wrap that up sometime. Also, we're doing some early prototypes into having animation drive dynamically simulated joints, so things like your punches can actually have some weight behind them. It's a little too early to show anything for this, but we've had some really cool prototypes for this so far. So quick recap, Roblox physics engine, we talked about the practical limits of the techniques we use, mass ratios, good constraint limits, how to optimize your geometry, how to read the microprofile, at least that you should, and touching a little on physics replication, network ownership units, interpolation, the buffer zone, importance of mechanism consistency, and some of the consequences for security. And wrapped up talking about things to come. So, thank you.